Okay, so we're back. This is part 2. Now that we've got a cube made, we want to do something with this geometry. Right now, I consider this geometry raw geometry. It just is what it is. You can click on it and you can affect it immediately. In fact, you can see that there's different ways of making selections just by looking over the instructor here. We have the select tool, and if I just click on a surface, I've selected that surface. Now, I can click on that surface, and if I hit the delete key, the surface goes away, and you can see that this thing is hollow. That the SketchUp surfaces are just made up of planes that are defined by lines. And in fact, if I wanted to recreate the plane here, or sort of heal this geometry, all I have to do is just simply let SketchUp know that I want that plane to exist by simply redrawing one of these edges, and there it fills in a plane. And that actually can be a confusing thing later on if you're trying to, if you've made a hole in your geometry and then you go to add another line, it might fill that hole in, and you didn't want it to be filled in. So you just have to be aware that every time you draw another line that might define a plane, SketchUp will show you a plane. It'll fill that plane in. So again, if we just select anything with a one click, it's selected. And now here I've selected one of the lines. If I delete that, you can imagine what's going to happen. This plane and this plane will disappear. So let's try it. There they go. Now if I recreate that line, it should recreate the planes that go with that line. And indeed, there it does. Okay, so I can select more than one thing. I can select the surface and all these edges. And I can do that a number of ways. One is I can hold down Shift, and now I get a little, my icon changes, and it looks like, so we zoom in here, you can see that the icon has a little plus minus symbol. And so long as I'm holding down Shift with my select tool, I'm able to select or deselect. It's kind of a toggle, right? So I'll zoom out here. So long as I'm holding the Shift key, I can select something or deselect it, depending on if I click it once, it's selected. If I click it again, it's deselected, right? Now, if I want to make sure that I'm only adding to my selection every single time I click, I can hold down Option, or probably Control on the PC. So now it's only got a plus symbol. So now every time I click, it's only adding to my selection. Okay, there's no opportunity to deselect here. But if I throw in the Shift key as well, so now it's Option Shift, these two keyboard things help you toggle. And you can see it's all right here. You can see in the modifier keys, you can see it tells you, it reminds you that Shift Option will now let you subtract from a selection. So now it's got a little minus sign by the pointer tool, and now everything I click, if it was selected, it's now no longer selected. So these are ways that you can add to your selection. Another way that you can add is to simply drag little marquees, just like the little animation was showing here. See, if you go from left to right or right to left, it shows you different little windows. So if I go left to right, starting up here, I click and hold down, and I'm going left to right, and then I let go. It doesn't look like it's selected anything. Actually, let me show you in here. Let's go from left to right, and I'll do this, and it's a solid window. You can see there's a little solid lined window, and when I release, it has selected one thing. Excuse me. And that one thing was the only thing that was entirely contained in this window. See, you can see that the other lines, the little window is touching the other lines of the geometry, but they're not fully contained inside my window. And so only this line was fully contained inside my selection window. I'll just click somewhere outside of the geometry to deselect. Now, if I want to select everything that touches my little window, I can make that selection window from the right to the left. So now if I click from the right hand side and go to the left, first of all, my selection window has little dashes instead of it being solid. And now you'll notice that anything touching those little dashed lines will get selected. See? Anything touching those lines became selected. Another way that you can select things is by how many times you click on them. So remember, if I clicked on this once, it just selected the surface. If I click twice, do a little double click, it selects the surface and the lines which define the surface. If I triple click really quickly here, it selects all geometry that's connected to each other. See, this geometry is connected to this, to this, to this. This is all connected geometry. So you can see that there's different ways of making selections. Now what I want to do is I want to select this entire piece of geometry, and I'm going to do something special to it. I'm going to put it in a group. Okay? So the first thing I do is to select this whole thing, I'm just going to triple click it. And now as I check that everything is selected, I can orbit around and I can see that indeed everything is selected. Now I can put it in this special little container called a group. And I can do that simply by right-clicking, and I can say Make Group. And now my cube is in a group. And you'll notice now that if I just touch it, if I just click on it once, the whole thing is selected. Remember how before, if I just clicked on it once, only the surface that I clicked on was selected. Well, see, now this is no longer sort of raw geometry. This cube is now inside of a container called a group. It's kind of like having a single bean that at one point you can touch the bean. You could click on this little bean, and you could select that one bean. But then you put this bean inside of a can, you know, like a can of beans. And now, in order to touch that bean, you have to go through the can. So really what you do is you pick up the can, so you click on the can. And the can is the container to the bean. So you're not actually picking up the bean itself when you pick up the can. You're actually picking up the can. But because the bean is inside the bean comes with you. It's also picked up. That might be a little bit confusing, but let's see if we can make it a little clearer as we go. So what I've got here, I'm actually going to skip over to a different file real fast here. I've got some geometry that I've already made, and this geometry is very easy to make. I actually took my polygonal tool here, and I just drew it out on the ground surface. I took my push-pull tool, and I was able to then push-pull my geometry up to a certain height. And in fact, once I did that, once I extruded or push-pulled this geometry once, the next time I went to do it again with another shape, all I had to do with my push-pull tool was to double-click, and it remembered the last time, it remembered the last height that I push-pulled something to, and it duplicated that. So just double-clicking will repeat the last push-pull that you did on any geometry. It doesn't really matter what the geometry is. If I'm push-pulling, it'll remember, if I double-click it, it remembers that height. Another way that you can match height, by the way, in geometry, is take my push-pull tool, and as I click and hold down, I can move my cursor anywhere. So as I'm still holding down my left mouse button, by the way, here. If I hover my mouse button over other geometry, it knows to snap my current push-pull to that height, to that geometry. So see here, I'm just inferencing these other heights, and when I release, it's now at the same height. Right? So that's another way of matching heights if you don't double-click. Like say you've already got some geometry that's existed for a while. Like now, if I want to push-pull this rectangle to be a volume that's the same height as this, sure, and if I double click, it's just remembering the last thing I did, but this is not the same height as that. And to prove it, we'll just pop into a perspective view here, and you can see that it's not quite high enough. So if I actually want to match this existing geometry, I would have to click and hold and drag my mouse over to touch the surface of this other geometry, and immediately this thing stops pulling, right? It stops extruding at that height. And so at that point I can just release, and now I know for sure this geometry is the same height as that geometry. So that's just a little trick. Alright, let's just get rid of that. What I want to show you here is that geometry comes in different containers. We already talked about groups, but I'm going to explain it a little bit better. This is raw geometry. Remember, I can just touch this geometry, and whatever I'm doing to it, it's just out there in the open. It's ready to be manipulated and moved, and if I select something and delete it, I'm only selecting that one face and deleting that one face. And I can redraw that face back in just by healing it. Now obviously I'm going to have to reapply the material there, and I'm not really going to show you that right now, but so we're not too worried about that, because we're not really dealing with materials at this point. However, you can take raw geometry and put it into a group, and that group is actually this container that protects it in some way. So here I'm just going to select, this is raw geometry, I'm going to select it and make it into a group. So I'm going to right click and I'm going to say make group. Now when you say make group, it puts this little container around it. And so now when I click on it, I'm not actually clicking on the raw geometry like I was here. Like here I'm actually clicking on raw geometry. Here I'm actually clicking on the container, on the group. And it just so happens that there's some geometry inside of it. Now if I ever wanted to get into that raw geometry again, I could edit this group. So I could right click and say edit group, and you see now I'm able to sort of go inside that container and touch the raw geometry again, and even SketchUp will give me a visual to let me know that this other geometry out here is not active. Now when I click out of it, I'm back out into the real space here, and I can click on my group again. A faster way of editing my group or getting into the group, that little container that if I want to actually touch my raw geometry again, is to just double click on it. See, there I am, and now I can touch the raw geometry, and I can do whatever I want to it. See, and I can extrude, push-pull faces, do whatever I want. And then when I click out of that geometry, there it is. Now it's inside the group again. Now that group, it can have more than one piece of geometry in it. And to illustrate that, I'll just take some of this raw geometry and I'm going to copy it over here using my Move Copy tool. The Move Copy tool, by the way, is kind of interesting. It's this symbol over here, and it's called Move Copy, but at first it looks like all it does is move things. And I can just click and then drag and then click again to place these. But you'll notice if you look at your instructor, it'll tell you all the ways that you can use your Move Copy tool. And it'll tell you that if you want to create a copy instead of just a move, that you have to add to the procedure here the Option key. So if I just tap the Option key, you'll notice that my cursor gets a little plus sign on it. And now I'm not just moving geometry, I'm actually copying that geometry. So I'm getting a duplicate of that geometry and I'm leaving the original behind. So here I've got two pieces of geometry, and I can select those two pieces, right click and say make group. And now they're in a group. Just like this one thing was in a group, these two things are in a group. And in fact, I can take these two groups and select those two things and right click and say make group. And now all of these things are in the group. Not this geometry. This geometry is not in the group. But what it does is it puts a big container around it, like a big box. around the outskirts of whatever is there. So if I touch this group, just because it looks like this geometry is inside, well, it's not. You can tell it's not because it's not outlined in blue like these ones are. These ones are outlined in blue. So if I wanted to, I could now move all of these things together just by selecting the group. So they all come together. The group is like this little container. It's like a shopping bag. And if I move my shopping bag, anything inside my shopping bag moves as well. So now if I wanted to actually access my shopping bag to move some of these, move my grapes around, I'd open the shopping bag by double-clicking to get into the group, right? That's how you edit the group. You can right-click and say Edit Group, or you can just double-click, and now I'm inside the group. I'm inside the shopping bag, right? Maybe that's a better analogy than the beans and the can thing that I was trying to do earlier. So think of it as a shopping bag. So now I'm able to take my, my grapes, and I can shift my grapes over a little bit inside the shopping bag, and we'll just do a little shift action here. And you can see now that my shopping bag is actually getting smaller. I'm making more efficient use of the space. Now I'm going to click out of that group, and now when I click on the group again, you can see that it's still a group, but I've moved things around in the group, which is nice. So again, you can embed groups within groups. So here I'm just going to open the group again. I'm going to double click, and here I've got another group. I'm going to double click on that, and now I've got raw geometry, and now I can manipulate this raw geometry how I want it. So maybe I'll make one of these smaller. Maybe I'll extrude one of, push-pull one of these edges here. So select that edge, and I can then push-pull it. Okay. So now I click out of this, and I'm still in the shopping bag, but these two are now together. I'm out of this group, and this is still in a group. And then when I click out of this, boom, they're all together in a group. This is a great way of organizing your geometry. And why this is important is if you had a house, for instance, a building, and I'll just do a really rough building here. Suppose you had a house and then you had a roof on this house and you wanted to move the roof independent of the actual building. So let's show you what happens if we don't make the roof separate from the building. So I'm just drawing this and then extrude it across here, and actually I'm going to reverse these faces. Okay, so here we go. We've got this really kind of weird building, this weird mass. Oh man, I did a really bad job of that. Okay, I'll tell you why geometry was blue in a minute, but don't worry about that for right now. So here we are. We've got our building, and I want to move this roof off the building for a minute. Maybe it's helpful for me to model the inside of the building. Maybe it's because that's what the client wants. So I go to try to select the roof, and I find that it's actually quite difficult to make this selection because every time I go to select the roof, it only selects one part of the roof, and then I have to come around here and manually select everything. Or if I try to select it all at once by triple clicking, it selects all the geometry because all the geometry is connected, right? This face is connected to here, it's connected to here. But if I draw the main body of the house and put it in a grocery bag, and then I draw the roof and I put that in a grocery bag, it'll just be two grocery bags sitting on top of each other, and if I move one grocery bag, it's going to leave the other grocery bag and all its contents behind. Okay, so let me just show you what that looks like. Let me erase this roof off of here. So here we are again. We've got our really nice little house. I'm gonna do like a couple windows in here, just to make it look like it's somewhat of a building. It's pretty bad house here, but we're just doing something really fast just to show you that it's a house. Okay, so there it is. We got this little house. Now what I want to do at this point is I know that I want major components to be separated from each other. I want the roof to be separated from the main building. So this is a very simple example, but I'm going to select all of this geometry and make it all in one group. And then I'm going to, outside of the group, I mean, I'm drawing on top of the group here, but it's not in the group. I'm going to draw a roof. And that roof is going to then get extruded or push-pulled across this. And then now you'll notice if I triple-click this, it only selects the roof. Because this geometry is only connected to this geometry, is only connected to this, is only connected to this. This geometry is not in this group, and so it's not connected. So I can triple-click this, and I can even move this really easily. No problem. I can do whatever I want, and it's not affecting below. It's not affecting what this stuff is in a group here. So I'm going to actually put this in a group as well. And now I can move this stuff around independent of each other. So this can move nicely, and this can move nicely. I usually decide what goes in a group based on what I think I will have to edit. So often that is determined by what, things that are really different materials, things that are really different geometry, or things that function very differently. And we'll talk about that a little bit more as we go. But for now, you can see that it's very easy to make these moves. If I want these things to be out, I want to get rid of them as being, I don't want them in a group anymore. I can just right-click and explode them. It doesn't do anything except get them out of the group. So now it's raw geometry again. And I can explode this. And now it's raw geometry. And now you'll notice that these are now touching each other. And if I triple-click, we're back to raw geometry. Everything is touching everything else. And now you can see that it's actually very difficult to select this roof. Again, I have to go through and laboriously make this selection. And now that I finally have this selection made, if I want to move it, let's grab the Move tool, you'll see that it messes with my geometry because it's connected. And I can't move it anymore. I could only move it when it was in a group. So now let me put this in a group again. Now I should be able to move it. There we go. So you want things organized in groups so that you can manipulate and move them around and edit them separately from other things. I can now go inside this group and I can edit this roof any old way I want. And it has no impact on the geometry below. I could take this whole thing and maybe scale it here. There you go. And now you can see I made that change and it did not affect the geometry here below. So I don't want, just because this is in a group, doesn't mean I can let this stay out here in raw geometry. For a couple reasons. One, it is better to organize things in groups just to have them in groups, right? I mean, this is the lower body of the house. It should be in a group. But two, when we start using layers, you're going to need things in groups. Okay, so I'm going to put this in a group. Now both these things are in groups. I want to show you something else. There's this other thing that's not a group. It's called a component. Now, I'll be honest with you, a component is pretty much the same thing as a group, only it's like a group on steroids. What a component does, and let's just make a component here. Okay, so if I right-click and say, instead of make group, I'll say make component. The first thing it does is it says, well, give me a name. That's fine. I'll just keep the default name. The next thing that I want to look at here, I'll go through all this stuff later, but I want to make sure that this is checked. Replace selection with component. I'm just going to accept all the defaults and hit create. And so now I've created a component. But it doesn't look much different from the group. In fact, if you click on them, they look the same. They have the same kind of blue box that goes around them. And really, the only way right now that I could tell if these things are different is if I right-click and I go to Entity Info. Now, Entity Info is a great little dialog box that comes up and tells you all kinds of details about your model. or whatever you've got selected in your model. So here, I've got nothing selected. Here, I select it, and it shows that I have one component, and that it's called component number 1, and that it's on layer 1, and that it has a certain volume. And if I come over here and I select this group, now you can see that entity info tells me that it's a group. Now, there's not much else that needs to tell me about it. Components. Let's go back to components now. Components are cool because just like groups, you can copy them. And so I'm going to go ahead and make some copies here. Now, I'm going to just make a copy, and then right after I make the copy, I want 3 more of these. So before I do anything else, I'm just going to hit on the keyboard 3x and hit enter. And now I have 3. I guess I wanted 3 more, so I should have hit 4x. But basically now that's a quick way of making multiple copies. I don't have to go here and make 1 copy and then 2 copies, and oh, I didn't get the spacing right. All I have to do is just say copy it from here to here and hit however number of copies you want. Let's do 6 copies, and then hit 6x for 6 times, and then hit enter, and it creates 5 more copies using the same spacing. Right, so that's a little trick. Okay, so let's do that with the group. Let's bring the group over here. In fact, I'm going to grab this raw geometry. I'm going to copy it over here, and I'm going to make it a group. Okay, so now we've got components over here, groups over here, and I'll go ahead and do the same thing. Now, I'm going to copy this group from here to here. I'm going to make a copy. So I'm just going to use this over here as a reference. So I have this selected. I have this group selected. I'll come over here and click on this. Hold down, click on Option to make it copy, and then copy from this point to this point. And there we go. We've got copies. And I'm going to make, 6 more of those. So I'll hit 7x. And so here we go. I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 copies. I made 6 more. And there's 8 of these things, and there's a bunch of these things. So here I've got groups. Here I've got components. They look pretty much the same. I mean, I colored them differently, so you can tell that they're different. But other than looking at their entity info, you have no idea that there's a difference really between what a component is and what a group is. So here's the difference. If I want to make a change to all of these, I could go in here and I could push-pull this down slightly. I could come back and go into this one, double-click, come back into here, double-click, come back into here, double-click, and you see it's taking me a while, but I can make a change to all of them. Trouble is I can't make a change to all of them at once. I have to go and I have to actually make a change to each one at a time. But components, if I have one component and then I copy it, well, I can make a change to any one of these and they'll all change. So I'm going to choose this one. I'm going to go into it by double clicking, and I'm going to make the height change to 1, and you'll see that they all changed at the same time. So that's the beauty of components. Now components are cool because say I wanted all of them to change except one of them. Well, I can easily fix that by just right-clicking on one of these and saying explode, and then I can turn it into a group. Or I could say make unique. And now this is still a component, but it's unique to any of these components. And to illustrate that, what I mean is now I can copy this component, and if I adjust these components, if I adjust my old components, this unique one didn't move. But I used this unique component to make other copies, and now if I click on any one of these, they change. And that wouldn't have happened if all I had done was right-click and say explode, and then make group. So there's a difference there. So components and groups, that's the difference between them. Now let's get to the nitty-gritty. And this is one of the key ways that you need to organize your drawing, your model, is by using groups and components. The key to whether you use a group or component is this. Always use a component if you have more than one of those things in your model. So if I'm making a fence post and I think I'm going to have more than one fence post, I better make this a component instead of a group. So what I'm going to do is here's what I'm not going to do. I'm not going to make a fence post and then make another fence post and let's just copy them to make it easier. I'm not going to make a bunch of fence posts and then right click and say make component and right click here and say make component and right click here and say make component. That's ridiculous because now these are all different components. They have nothing to do with each other. In fact, this is called component 3. This one's called, I don't know what it's called. This one's called component 4. So you don't want to do it that way. What you want to do when you're making components, so if I'm making a fence post, I'm going to make one fence post, make it a component, and then copy that component. It's that component that now I need to copy. Okay, so x5. Okay, so now if I make any adjustment to one of these, it affects all of them, right? So that's how you use components. With the roof, I'm only going to have one roof, so I just make it a group. Now you can put groups inside components and components inside the groups and stuff like that. Like for instance here, what I might want to do is, yeah, these are components, and so they're all the same, but if I wanted to select all my fence posts, it's a lot easier if I just grab all of them and put them all in a group, and then it makes it easy to just select them and move them around. Now, this group is made up of components. If I go inside the group, this is a component and this is a component. It doesn't really matter. I mean, I can have groups inside of groups inside of groups inside of groups. I can have components inside of components inside of components. I can have groups inside of components and components inside of groups. I mean, you can have things inside of other things. It's like going to the container store and buying a bunch of containers, and on your way out, they have you put all your containers in a big shopping bag, which is itself a container. So it's like those nesting dolls. But what you want to do is not nest too far. You don't want to have groups inside of groups inside of groups inside of groups inside of groups. I mean, if you can just keep it pretty shallow, that's better. So that's the idea. Okay, in the next video, I'm going to actually take you through building one of these.